Elena froze at the edge of the porch, her hand still on the gate, when she heard her own name spoken in a tone she did not recognize. "Honestly, she's a liability," Duke said, laughing lightly as he said it, like the words weighed nothing at all. "I could be doing so much more if she wasn't holding me back." The men around him laughed too. Nathan raised his glass. Owen shook his head and smiled, the kind of smile people give when they agree with something, but don't want to say it out loud. Derek just nodded, sipping his drink, watching Duke with something close to approval. Elena did not move. She stood there in the porch light, a bag of groceries in one hand, the evening breeze pulling at her hair, and she listened to her husband describe her, like she was a mistake he had not yet corrected. She had come home early. The kids were at her sister's for the night, and she had picked up the ingredients for Duke's favorite dinner, thinking she would surprise him before his friends arrived. She had planned to laugh with him in the kitchen, to hear about his day, to feel, even for one evening, like the two of them were still the people who had fallen in love 9 years ago. Instead, she was standing outside her own home, hidden behind the tall hedge that lined the porch, listening to the man she loved turn her into a joke for an audience of 3. "You're not wrong," Nathan said. "You could be running your own division by now. Instead, you're stuck justifying every decision to her." "It's not even that," Duke said, and Elena could hear the frustration creeping into his voice now, the kind of frustration that had been building for a long time and had finally found an audience willing to listen. "It's the way she looks at me when I talk about taking risks, like I'm reckless, like I need her permission." "That's marriage for you," Owen said, though his tone suggested he did not entirely believe his own words. "But some marriages hold you back more than others." Derek laughed. "Remember when you wanted to invest in that tech startup last year? She shut that down fast." "She said it was risky," Duke said. "Maybe it was. But so what? Everything worth doing is risky. I could have made real money." Elena's chest tightened. She remembered that conversation clearly. She remembered sitting across from Duke at their kitchen table, with the numbers spread out between them, showing him, gently, patiently, how the investment would have used almost everything they had saved for their daughter's education. She remembered him agreeing with her that night, nodding, saying she was right, thanking her for thinking it through when he had not. He had thanked her. And now, months later, he was telling his friends she had held him back. "Anyway," Duke said, waving a hand as if brushing the topic away, "that's just how it is. You marry someone, you think you know what you're getting, and then life happens. She used to be different. Now she just worries about everything. Bills, savings, the kids' schedules. It's exhausting." Elena felt something crack quietly inside her chest, not loudly, not violently, just a small, clean break, like a thread finally giving way after being pulled too many times. She thought about the mornings she woke up before everyone else to pack lunches and check homework. She thought about the nights she stayed up long after Duke had gone to sleep, going through the family's finances line by line, making sure every bill was paid on time, every saving goal was on track. She thought about the part-time job she had taken 2 years ago, not because she wanted to, but because Duke's business had gone through a rough patch and someone needed to keep things steady. She had done all of it quietly, without complaint, because that was what she believed love looked like. Showing up, holding things together, not needing praise for doing what needed to be done. And now he stood there, calling her a burden to men who barely understood what a real partnership looked like. She thought about walking through the gate right then. She imagined setting the groceries down on the porch step, walking into the circle of men, and asking Duke to repeat what he had just said to her face. But something held her back. Not fear exactly. Something quieter. A need to understand fully before she reacted. A lifetime of being told to stay calm, to think things through, to not let emotion take over. So she stood in the shadow of the hedge and she listened. "You know what the funny thing is?" Duke continued, his voice lower now, almost thoughtful. "I used to think she made me better. Now I think she just makes me smaller. Every big idea I have, she finds a reason it won't work. I'm starting to think if I want to actually build something for myself, I need to stop asking for her opinion at all." "So don't," Nathan said simply. "You're the one bringing in the ideas. She just manages the house. Let her do that, and you do what you do best." There it was. The words settled over Elena like a weight she had not asked to carry. Manages the house. As if raising 2 children, running a household, and quietly rescuing their finances more than once was some lesser task, something separate from the real work of building a life. As if she had never once stood beside Duke during the hardest years of his career, believing in him when even he doubted himself. She remembered the year his first business failed. She remembered him sitting on the edge of their bed at 2 a.m, saying he felt like nothing, like a failure, like he had wasted years chasing something that was never going to work. She remembered holding him that night, telling him none of that was true, telling him she still believed in him, telling him they would figure it out together. She had meant every word. He did not remember that night the way she did, it seemed, or maybe he simply chose not to. She wasn't always like this, Duke said, and for a moment his voice softened, just slightly, just enough that Elena almost believed some part of him still saw her clearly. When we were younger, she was fun, spontaneous. Now everything is about responsibility. I miss who she used to be. Elena wanted to laugh, though nothing about this felt funny. She wanted to ask him when exactly she had stopped being fun. Was it during the year he lost his job and she picked up 2 extra shifts to cover the mortgage? Was it during the months she spent researching schools and health plans and grocery budgets so their children would never feel the strain their family was under? Was it during every quiet sacrifice she had made so that he could keep chasing his dreams without ever once having to look down and see the ground she was holding steady beneath his feet? Fun did not disappear on its own. It got traded, piece by piece, for responsibility that someone had to carry. And somehow, in his mind, she had simply become less because of it. Anyway, Duke said again, his tone shifting back to something lighter, more careless, as though the conversation had already run its course in his mind. Let's not talk about this all night. Who wants another drink? The men laughed, the subject already forgotten, already replaced by something easier. Glasses clinked. Someone turned up the music slightly. Life, for them, moved on effortlessly, the way it always did for people who never had to notice the weight someone else was carrying for them. Elena stood there a moment longer, the grocery bag pressing into her palm, her heart pounding steadily now, not with panic, but with a clarity she had not expected. She looked at the house she had built with her own hands, at the warm light spilling from the windows, at the man laughing easily just beyond the hedge, and she understood something she had perhaps always known, but never let herself fully accept. Duke did not see her. Not really. Not the way she had always believed he did. She did not walk through the gate that night. She turned quietly, careful not to make a sound, and walked back down the path toward the street, the groceries still in her hand, her mind already moving faster than her feet. She had a great deal to think about, and for the first time in a long while, she was not thinking about how to fix things for someone else. She was thinking about herself. Elena did not go back inside that night. She drove instead, without any real destination, letting the streets carry her past familiar houses and quiet intersections she had crossed 1,000 times before. The groceries sat forgotten on the passenger seat, the bag slowly tipping as she took each turn, and she barely noticed when an onion rolled onto the floor. Her mind kept circling back to the same moment, replaying it over and over, as if repetition might somehow soften what she had heard. Duke's voice, the laughter of his friends, the word liability, spoken so easily, as though it cost him nothing to say it. She thought about calling her sister, Grace, but stopped herself before dialing. She was not ready to explain what had happened, not ready to hear the questions that would follow, not ready to turn her private pain into something spoken aloud. Some wounds needed silence first, before they could survive being named. Instead, she drove to the small park near their old apartment, the one they had lived in during the first years of their marriage, before children, before mortgages, before Duke's business ventures had reshaped their lives into something busier and more complicated. She parked the car and sat there for a long while, watching the streetlights flicker against the empty swings. It was strange, she thought, how a single sentence could unravel years of careful belief. She had always known, in some quiet corner of her mind, that Duke cared deeply about how others saw him. He always had. Even when they were young and broke, living paycheck to paycheck in a cramped apartment, he had cared about appearing successful, about being seen as someone who was going somewhere. She had found it endearing once, ambitious. She had believed his hunger for recognition came from a good place, a desire to build something meaningful for their family. She realized now she may have been wrong. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was Duke. "Hey, where are you? The guys are asking about dinner. I told them you were bringing food." She stared at the screen for a long moment before answering. Her voice, when it came, was steady, betraying none of what she felt inside. "Something came up. I'll be home later." "Later? Elena, I have people here." "I know," she said simply, and ended the call before he could respond. She sat in the silence that followed, feeling something unfamiliar settle over her. Not sadness exactly, though sadness was certainly present. It felt more like clarity, sharp and cold, cutting through years of soft excuses she had made for him without realizing it. She thought about their wedding day, 9 years ago, when Duke had stood in front of everyone and promised to build a life with her, to see her as an equal partner in everything they created together. She thought about the early years, when he used to ask her opinion on everything, when her voice mattered to him in every decision they made. Somewhere along the way, that had changed. She could not pinpoint the exact moment, but she understood now that it had been happening slowly, quietly, the way water wears away stone without anyone noticing, until the shape of everything has changed. She thought about their children, 6-year-old Mia and 8-year-old Caleb, currently staying at Grace's house for the night. She thought about the life she wanted for them, a life where love did not mean disappearing into someone else's shadow, where partnership meant being valued, not merely tolerated for the convenience you provided. By the time she drove home, it was well past 10. The house was quiet when she stepped inside. Duke's friends had left, their glasses still scattered across the kitchen counter, the smell of grilled food lingering faintly in the air. Duke sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through his phone, looking up when she entered. "There you are," he said, his tone carrying a mild irritation, though not enough to suggest he suspected anything was wrong. "You missed the whole thing. Nathan asked about you." "Did he?" Elena said flatly, setting her purse down on the counter. "Where were you anyway?" "You had the groceries. What happened?" She looked at him for a long moment, studying his face, searching for something she could not quite name. He looked tired, but unbothered. The same face she had loved for nearly a decade. Familiar in every line and expression, yet somehow suddenly unfamiliar in what it represented. "I needed some air," she said simply. Duke frowned slightly, but did not press further. He never did, not when it came to things that required him to slow down and consider her feelings more deeply. He returned his attention to his phone, already moving on, already forgetting the moment had happened at all. Elena began cleaning the kitchen in silence, gathering the scattered glasses, wiping down the counters, restoring order to the space the way she always did. As she worked, she found herself thinking about all the invisible labor she performed daily without acknowledgement. The meals planned around everyone's preferences but her own, the doctor's appointments remembered and scheduled, the small emotional repairs she made constantly, soothing tempers, smoothing arguments, keeping the family functioning like a machine no one else noticed, required careful maintenance. She thought about the years she had spent building this life, brick by careful brick, while Duke chased opportunities and dreams, some successful, many not. She had never once complained about the sacrifices required of her. She had simply done what needed to be done, believing that love meant showing up quietly, without demanding recognition. But love, she realized now, also required being seen, being valued, being spoken of with respect, especially in moments when you were not present to defend yourself. "You're quiet tonight," Duke said, glancing up again. "Just tired," she replied. It was not entirely a lie. She was tired, though not in the way he assumed. She was tired of a particular kind of exhaustion that came from years of quiet accommodation, of shrinking herself down to fit into spaces that never quite made room for her fully. That night, lying beside Duke in the darkness of their bedroom, Elena stared at the ceiling long after his breathing had settled into the steady rhythm of sleep. She thought about the conversation she had overheard, replaying it once more, examining it from every angle, searching for some explanation that might soften its impact. She found none. Instead, she found herself remembering smaller moments she had previously dismissed or excused. The time Duke had introduced her at a business dinner simply as his wife, without mentioning her name, her work, or anything about who she was as an individual. The time he had made a joke at a family gathering about how she worried too much about money, drawing laughter from relatives while she sat there, smiling tightly, absorbing the comment, because that was easier than making a scene. These moments, small on their own, began forming a pattern she had never allowed herself to see clearly before. A pattern of diminishment, disguised as humor, excused as personality, tolerated, because confronting it felt more disruptive than simply enduring it. She thought about her own mother, who had spent decades in a marriage where her voice mattered little, where her contributions were assumed rather than acknowledged, where she had eventually faded into a quiet, resigned version of herself that Elena had promised, as a young woman, she would never become. Was she becoming that woman now? Had she already become her, without fully realizing it? The question settled uncomfortably in her chest, refusing to be dismissed. Over the following days, Elena moved through her routine with an outward calm that masked the quiet reassessment happening within her. She continued packing lunches, managing schedules, attending to the daily rhythms of family life. But something had shifted internally, a careful distance beginning to form between herself and the version of her life she had accepted without question. She began noticing things she had previously overlooked. The way Duke spoke about his friends with more enthusiasm than he spoke about her. The way he consulted Nathan or Owen on decisions before ever mentioning them to her, despite the fact that she managed their household finances with far greater care and understanding than either of his friends ever demonstrated in their own lives. The way conversations at gatherings often centered around his ambitions, his ideas, his frustrations, while her own thoughts and opinions were treated as secondary considerations, if they were considered at all. She began, quietly, to observe her marriage as if from a slight distance, the way one might study a photograph to notice details previously missed. And the more she looked, the clearer the picture became. One evening, nearly a week after the incident at the party, Elena sat with her sister Grace over coffee, the children playing in the next room. Grace had noticed something different in Elena's demeanor, a quietness that seemed heavier than usual. "You've been different lately," Grace said carefully. "Is everything all right with Duke?" Elena hesitated, her hands wrapped around her coffee cup, considering how much to share. Finally she spoke, her voice steady but quiet. "I heard him talking to his friends last week, about me." Grace's expression sharpened with concern. "What did he say?" Elena took a slow breath before answering, the words still difficult to speak aloud even now. "He called me a liability." The silence that followed carried weight. Neither sister rushed to fill. Grace reached across the table, placing her hand gently over Elena's. "Elena, that's not okay." "I know," Elena said softly. "I've known for a while, I think. I just didn't want to see it clearly." Grace studied her sister carefully. "What are you going to do?" Elena looked up, her eyes clear despite the emotion behind them, her voice carrying a quiet resolve that surprised even herself. "I don't know yet, but I know I can't keep pretending everything is fine." Outside, the evening light faded slowly into dusk, and somewhere across town, Duke sat comfortably unaware, already planning his next gathering with friends, already moving forward without pause, without recognizing that the foundation beneath his life had begun, quietly and irrevocably, to shift. 2 weeks passed, and on the surface, life in the house continued as it always had. Duke left early for work, returned late most evenings, and spent his weekends split between family obligations and time with his friends. Elena managed the household with her usual quiet efficiency, though something inside her had changed permanently, a small but steady flame of awareness that refused to be extinguished. Duke, meanwhile, remained entirely unaware that anything had shifted. He was consumed by something new, a business opportunity that had recently come his way through Nathan, one that promised, according to Duke, to finally be the breakthrough he had been chasing for years. "It's a distribution deal," Duke explained one evening, spreading papers across the kitchen table with visible excitement. "Nathan knows a guy who's looking for investors. If this works out, we could be looking at real money, Elena, serious money." Elena studied the papers carefully, her eyes moving across the details with the same careful attention she applied to everything financial in their lives. She noticed immediately several concerns worth raising: inconsistencies in the projected returns, vague language around liability and risk, an absence of clear documentation regarding the company's actual financial history. "Have you seen their audited financials?" she asked carefully. "This document only shows projections, not actual performance." Duke waved a hand dismissively. Nathan's already looked into it. He trusts the guy running it. That's not the same as verified financial records, Duke. His jaw tightened slightly, a familiar tension Elena recognized from years of similar conversations. You always do this. Do what? Find reasons things won't work before even giving them a chance. Elena took a slow breath, choosing her words with deliberate care. I'm not saying it won't work. I'm saying we should look closer before investing money we can't afford to lose. It's not that much money, Duke said, though the number he mentioned moments later was, in fact, a significant portion of their remaining savings. Elena felt the familiar pull of concern, the same instinct that had guided her through years of careful financial stewardship. But this time, something else accompanied that instinct, a quiet awareness of how her caution would likely be received, remembered, and perhaps repeated to his friends, as further evidence of her being an obstacle rather than a partner. Let me think about it, she said finally, though her tone made clear she intended to research the opportunity thoroughly before agreeing to anything. Duke sighed audibly, gathering his papers with visible frustration. Fine. Think about it. Just don't take forever. Opportunities like this don't wait around. Over the following days, Elena quietly investigated the company Duke intended to invest in, using skills she had developed over years of managing their finances independently. What she discovered confirmed her earlier concerns. The company had a history of delayed payments to previous investors, and several online reviews from former business partners raised serious questions about the reliability of the people involved. When she presented her findings to Duke, laying out clear evidence rather than mere hesitation, his response was not gratitude, but irritation. You've been digging around behind my back? I wanted to understand what we'd actually be investing in, Elena said calmly. This isn't behind your back, Duke. This is protecting our family's money. Nathan's going to think I don't trust his judgment. This isn't about Nathan's judgment. This is about facts. Duke ran a hand through his hair, clearly torn between the evidence in front of him and his desire to maintain standing among his friends. Eventually, reluctantly, he agreed to hold off on the investment, though his tone carried more resentment than relief. That weekend, at another gathering with his friends, Elena arrived slightly late after dropping the children at a birthday party. As she approached the backyard where the group had gathered, she heard Duke's voice again, this time discussing the investment decision. Turns out the deal wasn't as solid as we thought, Duke said, his tone carefully neutral, avoiding any direct credit toward Elena's research. Good thing we didn't jump in too fast. Smart move, Owen said. Who caught that? There was a brief pause before Duke answered. I did some digging, wanted to be careful. Elena stood at the edge of the patio, listening to her own work being quietly claimed by someone else, her contribution erased entirely from the story being told. She felt something familiar tighten in her chest, though this time it carried less shock and more confirmation of a pattern she had already begun to understand clearly. She stepped forward, making her presence known, and Duke glanced up, his expression flickering briefly with something like discomfort before settling into practiced ease. There you are, he said. The kids get dropped off okay? They're fine, Elena replied evenly, taking a seat beside him, without further comment on what she had overheard. The conversation continued around her, drifting toward other topics, other plans, other ambitions Duke seemed increasingly eager to pursue. Elena listened quietly, participating when directly addressed but otherwise observing the dynamic among the group with newfound clarity. She noticed how often Duke sought validation from his friends, how his opinions seemed to shift subtly depending on who was in the room, how his confidence appeared entirely dependent on the approval of others, rather than any internal sense of security. She noticed, too, how his friends encouraged this dependency, feeding his ego with praise and agreement, rarely challenging his ideas in any meaningful way. It was, she realized, an environment perfectly designed to inflate a person's sense of self, while diminishing anyone who dared to introduce caution or reality into the conversation. Later that evening, as they drove home together, Duke seemed unusually talkative, energized by the evening's conversations. Nathan's talking about starting something bigger next year, a real venture, not just small investments. He wants me involved from the beginning. That sounds like a big commitment, Elena said carefully. It is, but it's the kind of opportunity that changes everything. I could finally build something real, Elena. Something people respect. She glanced toward him in the passenger seat light, studying the excitement in his expression. People already respect the work you do, Duke. He shook his head slightly. Not the way I want them to. Not yet. There it was again, that persistent hunger for external validation. A hunger that seemed to grow larger the more it was fed, never quite satisfied by what he already had, always reaching toward something just beyond his grasp. What would this venture involve exactly? Elena asked. Duke's enthusiasm dimmed slightly, replaced by a more guarded tone. It's still early. Nathan's working out the details. I'll fill you in once things are more solid. Elena recognized the pattern immediately, the same careful distancing he employed whenever he anticipated her asking questions he did not yet want to answer. She said nothing further, though the silence between them carried its own quiet weight. Over the following weeks, Duke's involvement with Nathan's new venture deepened steadily. He began spending more evenings away from home, attending meetings Elena knew little about, returning late with vague explanations that offered few concrete details. The household routine, previously balanced between shared responsibilities, gradually shifted further onto Elena's shoulders as Duke's attention drifted increasingly toward his growing ambitions. She managed it as she always had, without complaint, though the quiet resentment building within her continued to accumulate steadily beneath her calm exterior. One evening, while helping Caleb with his homework at the kitchen table, Elena overheard Duke on a phone call in the next room, his voice carrying just enough for her to catch fragments of the conversation. No, she doesn't know the full details yet. I'll tell her when it's finalized. She'll probably have concerns, but I'm not letting that slow things down this time. Elena's hand paused over Caleb's math worksheet, her attention fully captured by what she had just heard. She did not confront Duke immediately, choosing instead to wait, to observe, to gather a clearer understanding before reacting. Days later, she discovered, through a stack of mail left carelessly on the counter, a document related to a business loan application, one that listed both their names as joint applicants, requesting a sum that would place significant strain on their family's financial stability. Her heart pounded as she read through the details, understanding immediately the scope of what Duke intended to pursue, without her full knowledge or consent. When she confronted him that evening, his response revealed, more clearly than ever before, the depth of the imbalance that had settled into their marriage. I was going to talk to you about it properly, he said, though his tone carried more frustration at being caught than genuine remorse. I just didn't want you shutting it down before I even had a chance to explain. This loan uses our house as collateral, Duke. I know what it uses. Did it occur to you that this affects both of us? That I have a right to know before you apply for something like this? Duke's expression hardened slightly. I knew you'd overreact. This isn't overreacting. This is basic partnership. Partnership, he repeated, something bitter creeping into his voice. Every time I try to build something for us, you find a reason to hold back. I'm tired of asking permission for every decision I make. Elena stood there, absorbing his words, recognizing in them the same sentiment she had overheard weeks earlier at the party, dressed now in slightly different language but carrying the same underlying meaning. To Duke, her caution was not protection. It was restriction. Her voice was not partnership. It was an obstacle standing between him and the version of himself he desperately wanted to become. I'm not holding you back, she said quietly. I'm trying to protect what we've built together. Maybe I don't want protection anymore, Duke said. Maybe I want a partner who believes in me, without constantly questioning everything. The words hung heavily in the air between them, revealing a fracture neither of them had fully acknowledged until that moment. Elena looked at her husband, searching his face for some sign of the man she had married, the one who had once valued her insight, who had once seen her caution as wisdom rather than weakness. She was no longer certain that man still existed. I need to think, she said finally, turning away before he could respond, leaving him standing alone in the kitchen with his loan documents and his unspoken ambitions, the distance between them widening steadily with each passing moment. Elena did not sleep that night. She lay awake long after Duke had settled into the guest room, a silent agreement between them that neither had spoken aloud, but both understood clearly. Some distances did not require words to establish themselves. She spent the early morning hours sitting at the kitchen table, the loan documents spread before her once more, studying every line with careful attention. The numbers told a story far larger than a single conversation could capture, a story of risk, of desperation, of a man chasing validation with a recklessness he had never before displayed so openly. By the time the sun rose fully, Elena had made a decision, not about her marriage entirely, but about the immediate matter at hand. She would not sign the loan documents. Whatever happened between herself and Duke moving forward, she would not risk the stability of their children's future on an unproven venture, built on borrowed confidence and quiet manipulation. When Duke emerged from the guest room later that morning, dressed for work, his expression carried the careful neutrality of someone attempting to move past an uncomfortable situation without addressing it directly. "I'm not signing the loan application," Elena said before he could speak, her voice calm but firm. Duke paused, his jaw tightening slightly. "Elena, we talked about this." "No, you talked. I listened. This decision affects our entire family, and I won't put our home at risk for a venture I haven't seen proper documentation for. Nathan trusts the numbers." "Nathan isn't the one whose name is on our mortgage." Duke stared at her for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes, though whether it was anger or reluctant understanding, Elena could not entirely tell. Eventually, he simply nodded once, sharply, and left for work without further discussion. The silence that followed his departure felt different from previous silences between them. It carried a finality, a sense that something fundamental had shifted, though neither of them had yet spoken the words that would make that shift undeniable. That afternoon, Elena visited Grace again, seeking not just comfort but clarity, a space where she could think through everything that had accumulated over the past several weeks, without the immediate pressure of managing Duke's reactions. "He wanted to put the house at risk, without even telling me first," Elena explained, her voice steady, despite the emotion beneath it. "And when I found out, he acted like I was the one causing problems." Grace listened carefully, her expression a mixture of concern and quiet anger on her sister's behalf. "Elena, this isn't just about one bad decision. This is a pattern. You've told me about the comment at the party, about him taking credit for your work, and now this." "I know," Elena said quietly. "I keep trying to find explanations. Stress from work, pressure from his friends, insecurity about his career. But at some point, explanations stop being enough. What do you want to do?" Elena considered the question carefully before answering. "I don't know if I want to end things. I still remember who we used to be together, but I know I can't keep shrinking myself to make room for someone who doesn't see my value." Grace reached across the table, squeezing her sister's hand gently. "Whatever you decide, you don't have to go through it alone." Over the following days, Elena began quietly preparing herself for whatever might come next, though she remained uncertain about the exact path forward. She reviewed their financial accounts carefully, ensuring she understood every detail of their shared assets and obligations. She spoke with a financial advisor recommended by a coworker, gathering information not with the intention of immediate separation, but simply to understand her options clearly, to no longer feel dependent on Duke's version of their financial reality. She also began paying closer attention to her own needs, something she realized she had neglected for years, in favor of managing everyone else's. She resumed an old hobby, painting, something she had abandoned years earlier, when family responsibilities had consumed most of her free time. She found, in the quiet hours spent with brush and canvas, a small but meaningful return to herself, a reminder that she existed as more than a role within someone else's story. Duke, meanwhile, continued pursuing his venture with Nathan, seeking alternative funding sources after Elena's refusal to sign the loan application. He grew increasingly distant during this period, his evenings consumed by meetings and phone calls, his attention rarely turning toward home or family unless directly required. One evening, nearly 2 weeks after their confrontation over the loan, Elena attended a school event for Caleb without Duke, who had cited an important meeting as his reason for absence. Standing among other parents, watching her son proudly present his classroom project, Elena felt a familiar ache settle in her chest, not simply from Duke's absence, but from the growing realization that his priorities had shifted so completely away from the family they had built together. After the event, another parent, a woman named Priya, whom Elena had known casually for several years, approached her with a friendly smile. "Caleb did wonderful today. Is Duke traveling for work?" Elena hesitated only briefly before answering honestly. "He had a meeting he couldn't reschedule." Priya nodded understandingly, though something in her expression suggested she recognized the familiar pattern of an absent partner more clearly than Elena had expected. It's hard, isn't it, balancing everything on your own? Yes, Elena admitted quietly. It is. The brief exchange stayed with her throughout the evening, a small but meaningful acknowledgement of an experience she had rarely allowed herself to voice openly. She was not imagining the imbalance in her marriage. Others could see it too, even in small glimpses, even without knowing the full extent of what had occurred. That night, after putting the children to bed, Elena sat alone in the living room, scrolling absently through old photographs on her phone, images capturing years of family memories, vacations, birthdays, quiet ordinary moments that had once felt so secure and permanent. She paused on a photograph from their honeymoon, Duke's arm wrapped around her shoulders, both of them laughing at something now forgotten, their faces carrying an ease and joy she barely recognized in either of them anymore. She wondered, staring at that photograph, when exactly the shift had begun. Had it happened gradually, so slowly neither of them noticed, until the damage had already accumulated significantly? Or had certain qualities always existed within Duke, qualities she had simply chosen not to see clearly during the early years of their relationship, blinded perhaps by love, by hope, by the belief that partnership meant unconditional patience, regardless of how one was treated in return? She did not have clear answers to these questions, but she understood, with increasing certainty, that whatever explanation existed did not change the reality of her present circumstances. She deserved to be seen, valued, and respected by the person she had chosen to build a life with. And increasingly, she doubted whether that person still existed within the man she had married. Duke returned home later that night, well past 10. His expression tired, but carrying an undercurrent of frustration Elena had grown accustomed to recognizing. "Meeting went long," he said, settling onto the couch beside her without any real acknowledgement of her evening, or the school event he had missed. "Caleb did well today," Elena said quietly. "He asked why you weren't there." Duke sighed, running a hand across his face. "I know. I'll make it up to him." "You've said that before." His eyes flickered toward her, something defensive rising quickly in his expression. "I'm trying to build something for this family, Elena. That requires sacrifice. Sacrifice shouldn't mean disappearing from your children's lives. That's not fair, isn't it?" They sat in tense silence for several moments, the weight of unspoken accusations settling heavily between them. Finally, Duke spoke again, his voice quieter now. Though whether from genuine reflection or simple exhaustion, Elena could not entirely determine. "I don't know how to make you understand what this means to me. This venture isn't just about money. It's about finally feeling like I've accomplished something significant, something people respect. People already respect you, Duke. Your children respect you. I respect you, or at least, I did." The past tense in her final words seemed to land heavily, and Duke's expression shifted, something like alarm, briefly crossing his features. "Did?" Elena looked at him steadily, choosing her words with careful deliberation. "I'm trying to hold on to respect for the man I married, but you're making that increasingly difficult." Duke opened his mouth, as if to respond, then closed it again, apparently uncertain how to address the quiet, but undeniable ultimatum embedded within her words. The conversation ended there, neither of them fully resolving the tension between them, though both understood, in that shared silence, that something significant had shifted permanently within their marriage. In the days that followed, Elena continued her quiet preparations, gathering information, strengthening her own sense of independence, while simultaneously remaining open to the possibility that Duke might still choose to change course. She did not want their marriage to end. She wanted, more than anything, for the man she had fallen in love with to re-emerge from beneath the layers of insecurity and ambition that seemed to have overtaken him. But hope, she was beginning to understand, could not carry a marriage entirely on its own. At some point, actions needed to align with words, and patterns needed to shift meaningfully, rather than simply pausing temporarily before resuming their familiar course. She was watching closely now, waiting to see which direction Duke would ultimately choose. The final confrontation arrived on an ordinary Thursday evening, without warning, without the build-up that might have prepared either of them for what was about to unfold. Elena had spent the day catching up on errands, picking up the children from school, preparing dinner, moving through her routine with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done these tasks countless times before. Duke arrived home earlier than usual, his expression carrying an energy Elena had not seen from him in weeks, something bright and eager that immediately put her on alert. "I found new investors," he announced, barely waiting until he had entered the kitchen before sharing the news. "Nathan connected me with someone outside the initial group. We don't need the loan against the house anymore." Elena paused, setting down the knife she had been using to chop vegetables, studying her husband's expression carefully. "That's good news, if it's true." "It is true. I signed preliminary paperwork today." Something in his tone caught her attention immediately. "Preliminary paperwork? What kind of paperwork?" Duke waved a hand dismissively, moving toward the refrigerator, as though the matter required no further discussion. "Just an agreement outlining initial terms. Nothing binding yet." "Duke, I need to see whatever you signed." "It's fine, Elena. I've got it handled." "You said that about the loan too." His expression hardened slightly at the reminder. "This is different. I'm not asking you to sign anything this time." The implication in his words landed clearly, and Elena felt something cold settle in her chest. "You're moving forward without me entirely now." "I'm moving forward, period. I'm tired of every decision requiring your approval before I can act." Elena took a slow breath, steadying herself before responding. "This isn't about approval, Duke. This is about partnership, about making major financial decisions together, especially ones that could affect our children's future. The children are fine. They have everything they need." "Do they? Or are they simply used to their father being absent most evenings while chasing something he refuses to fully explain?" Duke's jaw tightened, his earlier excitement fading rapidly into defensive frustration. "That's not fair." "Isn't it? When was the last time you helped Caleb with his homework? When was the last time you attended one of Mia's activities without being reminded 3 times? I work hard to provide for this family. You used to work hard for this family. Lately, you work hard for yourself, for your image, for your friends' approval. There's a difference, Duke, and I think somewhere along the way, you stopped being able to see it." The kitchen fell into tense silence, broken only by the sound of the children's cartoon playing faintly from the living room. Duke stared at her, something conflicted passing across his features, though his pride, as it often did, quickly overpowered whatever brief moment of self-reflection might have surfaced. "You know what your problem is?" he said finally, his voice rising slightly. "You've never fully believed in me." "Not really. You tolerate my ambitions, but you never actually support them." "That's not true, and you know it." "Is it? Because every single time I try to build something meaningful, you find a reason to doubt it. The startup, the loan, now this. It's exhausting, Elena. It makes me feel like I'm constantly fighting against my own wife instead of building a life with her." Elena felt something inside her shift, a familiar surge of guilt rising instinctively, the same guilt that had, for years, caused her to soften her positions, to accommodate his frustrations, to prioritize his emotional comfort over her own legitimate concerns. But this time, she recognized the pattern clearly enough to resist its pull. "I have supported you through every failure and every uncertain venture for 9 years, she said, her voice steady, despite the emotion building within her. "I supported you when your first business collapsed. I supported you when you doubted yourself at your lowest moments. I have never once stopped believing in your potential, Duke. But supporting you does not mean blindly agreeing with every decision you make, especially decisions that put our family's security at risk." "So what? I'm supposed to just accept limitations forever? Never take real risks?" "No. You're supposed to include me as an equal partner in decisions that affect both of us. That's not limitation. That's basic respect." Duke ran both hands through his hair, frustration radiating from every movement. "I don't know how to make you understand what this means to me." "Then help me understand," Elena said, her voice softening slightly, genuinely attempting one final time to reach whatever remained of the man she had married. "Talk to me, Duke. Not at me, not around me, with me." For a brief moment, something shifted in his expression, a flicker of vulnerability breaking through the defensive posture he had maintained throughout the conversation. But it disappeared as quickly as it had emerged, replaced almost immediately by renewed frustration. "I heard you," he said quietly. "But it's already done." "What's already done?" "The agreement. I signed it. I'm moving forward with this, Elena. With or without your approval." The words landed heavily, and Elena felt something inside her settle into a quiet, unmistakable clarity. Without my approval, she repeated slowly. You've made your choice clear then. It's not about choosing between you and this opportunity. Isn't it? Because from where I'm standing, you've chosen to exclude me entirely from a decision that affects our shared future. That is a choice, Duke, whether you want to frame it that way or not. He opened his mouth to respond, but Elena continued before he could speak. Years of carefully suppressed feelings finally finding their voice. I heard what you said about me at your party several weeks ago, she said quietly. I heard you call me a liability to your friends. I stood outside, listening to you describe me as someone holding you back, as though everything I've done for this family over the past 9 years meant nothing. Duke's face paled slightly, clearly caught entirely off guard by the revelation. Elena, that was just... Don't say it was just a joke, she interrupted firmly. Don't minimize it. You meant it, Duke. Maybe not consciously, maybe not with full awareness of how deeply it would affect me, but you meant it. And ever since that night I've been watching you, watching this pattern play out again and again, and I finally understand something I think I've been avoiding for a very long time. What's that? He asked quietly, his earlier defensiveness giving way to something more uncertain. You don't see me as your equal anymore. You see me as an obstacle to the person you're trying to become, and I can't keep shrinking myself to accommodate that perception. The kitchen fell into heavy silence, the weight of years finally settling fully into the space between them. Duke stood there, visibly shaken, though whether from genuine remorse or simple shock at being confronted so directly, Elena could not entirely determine. I don't know what to say, he admitted finally, his voice quieter than before. You don't have to say anything right now, Elena replied, her voice steady, despite the emotion trembling just beneath its surface. But I need you to understand something clearly. I love you, Duke. I have loved you for 9 years, through every difficult season, every uncertain moment. But love isn't enough on its own to sustain a partnership where one person consistently diminishes the other, whether through careless words or thoughtless actions. I'm not trying to diminish you. Maybe not intentionally, but that doesn't change the outcome. Duke sat down slowly at the kitchen table, his earlier energy completely drained, replaced by something heavier, more contemplative. What do you want me to do? Elena considered the question carefully before answering, choosing her words with deliberate precision. I want you to genuinely reflect on how you've been treating this marriage, and me, over these past several months. Not defensively, not with excuses, just honestly. And if I do that, then we'll see where things stand. But Duke, I need you to understand something clearly. I'm not willing to continue as things currently are. Something has to change, meaningfully, not temporarily. He nodded slowly, though Elena could sense the uncertainty still present beneath his composed exterior, the same uncertainty that had, in various forms, guided many of his poorer decisions throughout their marriage. That night, they slept in separate rooms once more, the silence between them carrying a different weight than before, heavier, more permanent. The quiet before something significant was set irreversibly into motion. Elena lay awake for a long while, staring at the ceiling, feeling simultaneously exhausted and clearer than she had in weeks. She had said what needed to be said. Whatever happened next would depend entirely on how Duke chose to respond, on whether he possessed the capacity for genuine change, or whether his patterns had already become too deeply ingrained to shift meaningfully. She did not know the answer yet. But for the first time in a long while, she felt prepared to face whatever came next, regardless of the outcome. The days following their confrontation carried a strange, fragile quality, neither peace nor open conflict, but something suspended uncomfortably between the two. Duke made small, visible efforts during that time, arriving home earlier on several evenings, attending Mia's dance recital without needing multiple reminders, helping Caleb with homework at the kitchen table one evening while Elena prepared dinner nearby. For a brief moment, Elena allowed herself a fragile hope that perhaps something had genuinely shifted, that her words had reached him in a way previous conversations had not. But hope, she would soon learn, required more than a few isolated gestures to fully restore what had been damaged over months of accumulated neglect and dismissal. The unraveling began on a Saturday afternoon, nearly 10 days after their confrontation, when Elena discovered a text message notification on Duke's laptop, left open on the kitchen counter while he showered upstairs. She had not intended to look, had never made a habit of monitoring his devices throughout their marriage, but the message preview appeared clearly on the screen, impossible to ignore once seen. It was from Nathan. Elena's cleanup already saved us once. Let's make sure she doesn't slow this next round down too. Elena stood frozen, staring at the screen, feeling something cold and final settle deep within her chest. She scrolled further, unable to stop herself now that the door had been opened, and found additional messages confirming what she had already begun to suspect. Duke had continued moving forward with the investment venture, using funds from a separate account Elena had not been aware existed, one apparently opened weeks earlier without her knowledge. The betrayal was not simply financial, though the financial implications were significant enough on their own. It was the deliberate concealment, the calculated decision to exclude her entirely, to treat her, even after everything she had said, as someone to be managed rather than genuinely partnered with. When Duke came downstairs sometime later, he found Elena sitting at the kitchen table, his laptop open before her, her expression carrying a stillness more unsettling than any anger could have conveyed. "Elena, what are you doing?" "I saw the messages from Nathan," she said quietly. "About the separate account. About the investment you continued pursuing, despite everything we discussed." Duke's face shifted through several emotions in rapid succession: surprise, guilt, and finally, a defensive hardening that Elena had come to recognize all too well. "I was going to tell you once things were finalized." "You've said that before, Duke, about the loan, about this same venture. When exactly does telling me actually happen? Before or after every decision is already irreversible?" "I didn't want another argument. So instead, you chose deception." The word landed heavily between them, and for a moment, Duke seemed to genuinely absorb its weight, his shoulders sagging slightly, his earlier defensiveness faltering. "I didn't think of it as deception. I thought I was protecting the family from unnecessary stress." "You were protecting yourself from having to include me as an equal partner in decisions that affect our shared future," Elena replied evenly. "That's not protection, Duke. That's control." He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, apparently recognizing, perhaps for the first time, the accuracy embedded within her words. But recognition alone, Elena understood now, would not be enough to undo the pattern that had defined so much of their recent months together. "I need you to leave the room while I think," she said quietly. "I can't have this conversation with you standing over me right now." Duke hesitated, clearly wanting to say something further, but ultimately retreated upstairs, without additional argument, leaving Elena alone, with the laptop and the full weight of what she had discovered. She spent the following hour reviewing every available detail, tracing the separate account, understanding fully the extent of what Duke had done. The amount involved was significant, though not yet catastrophic, still recoverable if addressed immediately. But the deeper damage, Elena understood clearly, existed beyond the numbers themselves. It existed in the fundamental breach of trust that no amount of financial recovery could fully repair. That evening, after putting the children to bed, Elena made her decision. She would not continue living within a marriage defined by concealment, dismissal, and quiet manipulation, regardless of whatever genuine love might still exist beneath these patterns. She loved Duke, perhaps she always would in some form, but love without respect, without honesty, without genuine partnership, was not sustainable, not for herself, and certainly not for the example she wanted to set for her children. She spent the next several days quietly preparing, contacting a lawyer recommended by a colleague, arranging practical matters with the same careful efficiency she had always applied to managing their household. She did not rush the process, nor did she allow herself to be swayed by Duke's increasingly desperate attempts to reconcile, once he realized the seriousness of her intentions. "Elena, please," he said one evening, finding her packing a suitcase in their bedroom. "We can fix this. I'll close the account. I'll pull out of the investment entirely." "It's not just about the investment, Duke," Elena said calmly, continuing to fold clothing into the suitcase without pausing. "It's about everything that led to this point. The comment at your party. Taking credit for my work. Excluding me from decisions. Choosing your friend's approval over basic honesty with your own wife. I can change. I hope you can, Elena said, finally looking up at him directly. For your own sake, and for our children's sake. But I can't keep waiting for that change to happen while continuing to absorb the consequences of choices you've made without me. Where will you go? Grace's house, for now. The children and I need space to think clearly, away from the tension that's been building here. Duke's expression crumbled slightly, the reality of the situation finally penetrating the careful denial he had maintained throughout their recent conflicts. You're really leaving. I'm giving both of us space, Elena replied. What happens after that depends entirely on you. That night, Elena loaded the car quietly while the children waited inside, sensing, even without full understanding, that something significant was shifting within their family. Duke stood on the porch, watching silently, his earlier attempts at negotiation seemingly exhausted, replaced now by a stunned, disbelieving stillness. As Elena secured the final bag in the trunk, she paused, looking back toward the house they had built together, toward the man standing motionless on the porch, watching the life he had taken for granted quietly begin to slip away from him. I never wanted things to reach this point, she said quietly, more to herself than to him. Duke said nothing, his expression carrying a mixture of grief and disbelief that Elena recognized but no longer felt responsible for repairing. She had spent years managing his emotions, softening his disappointments, protecting him from the consequences of his own choices. That responsibility, she understood now, was no longer hers to carry. She helped the children into the car, offering them gentle reassurance about visiting their father soon, about everything eventually being okay, though even she was uncertain exactly how their story would unfold from this point forward. As she pulled out of the driveway, glancing briefly in the rearview mirror, she saw Duke still standing on the porch, his figure growing smaller in the distance, motionless, as though genuinely unable to process the magnitude of what was happening before him. For the first time in months, Elena felt something unexpected settle over her, not sadness exactly, though sadness remained present beneath the surface, but something closer to relief, a quiet, steady sense that she had finally chosen herself, chosen her children's well-being, chosen a version of partnership that demanded genuine respect rather than quiet endurance. She did not know what the future held, but she knew, with unmistakable clarity, that she was no longer willing to shrink herself into a role that diminished her worth, simply to maintain the comfortable illusion of a stable marriage. Behind her, the house grew smaller, then disappeared entirely from view, and ahead of her, an uncertain, but entirely her own future waited to unfold. Duke remained on the porch long after Elena's car had disappeared down the street, the silence of the empty house behind him pressing heavily against his chest. He stood there for what felt like hours, though it had likely been only minutes, his mind struggling to process the sudden emptiness that had settled over his once familiar life. He walked inside eventually, moving through rooms that suddenly felt unfamiliar in their stillness. The children's toys remained scattered across the living room floor. Elena's favorite mug sat unwashed beside the sink. Every corner of the house carried traces of the life he had built alongside her, a life he had somehow allowed to slip through his fingers while chasing something far less meaningful. He called Nathan later that evening, needing someone to talk to, someone who might offer reassurance or perspective on what had just occurred. She actually left? Nathan asked, his tone carrying more surprise than genuine concern. Took the kids to her sister's place, Duke said, his voice hollow. She'll come back, Nathan said dismissively. These things happen. Give her a few days. But Duke, even in his current state of shock, recognized something false in Nathan's casual reassurance, a lack of genuine understanding regarding the weight of what had actually transpired. I don't think it's that simple this time. Look, don't stress about it too much. Focus on the investment. Once the returns start coming in, everything else will fall into place. She'll see you were right to push forward. Duke ended the call shortly afterward, an unfamiliar unease settling over him as he considered Nathan's words more carefully. For years, he had valued Nathan's opinion, had sought his approval and guidance across countless decisions, both personal and professional. But sitting alone now in his empty house, Duke began questioning, for the first time, whether that guidance had ever truly served his best interests, or whether it had simply fed an insecurity he had never fully addressed within himself. Over the following weeks, The investment venture Duke had pursued so aggressively began revealing serious problems. The company Nathan had connected him with missed its first promised payout entirely, offering vague explanations about delayed contracts and administrative complications. Duke, increasingly anxious, reached out repeatedly for updates, receiving only evasive responses that offered little genuine reassurance. He confided his growing concerns to Owen and Derek during a rare gathering, hoping for support similar to what he had always received from his friend group in the past. "I told you these things take time," Owen said, though his earlier enthusiasm for the venture seemed notably diminished. "Don't panic yet. Have you gotten any returns yourself?" Duke asked. Owen hesitated slightly before answering. "Not yet, but I'm not as heavily invested as you are." The comment landed uncomfortably, revealing a truth Duke had perhaps subconsciously avoided acknowledging. He had invested more heavily than any of his friends, driven by a desperate need to prove himself, to finally achieve the kind of success he believed would earn him lasting respect and admiration. "Nathan seems so confident about this," Duke said quietly. Derek shrugged, his expression carrying a casual indifference that struck Duke as particularly cold given the circumstances. "Nathan's confident about a lot of things. Doesn't mean they always work out." The conversation continued for a while longer, but Duke found himself increasingly disconnected from the group dynamic he had once found so reassuring. Their casual dismissiveness, once mistaken for confidence and camaraderie, now revealed itself as something far more hollow, a shared performance of success and certainty that none of them, apparently, genuinely possessed. As weeks passed without resolution regarding the investment, Duke's financial situation grew increasingly precarious. Bills accumulated, the separate account Elena had discovered dwindling rapidly as promised returns failed to materialize. He began working longer hours at his regular job, attempting to compensate for the financial strain, though exhaustion and stress made him noticeably less effective, drawing quiet concern from his supervisor. Throughout this period, Duke reached out to Elena repeatedly, hoping for reconciliation, though her responses remained measured and cautious, offering little indication of how their relationship might ultimately resolve. "I need more time," she told him, during one particularly difficult phone call. "This isn't something that gets fixed with a few apologies, Duke. I need to see genuine, sustained change." "I'm trying," he insisted. "I've stepped back from the investment as much as I can at this point. I've been reflecting on everything you said." "That's a start," Elena replied carefully. "But actions matter more than words right now." Duke found himself, for the first time in years, genuinely reflecting on his own behavior, examining patterns he had previously dismissed or excused. He began recognizing, with growing discomfort, the numerous instances where he had prioritized his friend's approval over Elena's well-being, where he had dismissed her concerns not because they lacked merit, but because acknowledging their validity would have required confronting uncomfortable truths about his own insecurities. One evening, alone in the increasingly quiet house, Duke discovered an old photo album Elena had kept from their earliest years together. He sat on the living room floor, flipping through pages capturing moments he had nearly forgotten, evidence of a partnership built on genuine mutual respect and shared dreams, long before ambition and insecurity had begun eroding its foundation. He found a photograph from their first apartment, both of them laughing over a poorly cooked dinner, their faces carrying an unguarded joy he barely recognized in his more recent memories. He remembered, looking at that image, how Elena's opinion had once meant everything to him, how her steady presence had felt like strength rather than restriction. Somewhere along the way, external validation had begun replacing that internal foundation, and Elena, the person who had always seen him most clearly, had become, in his distorted perception, an obstacle standing between himself and the person he desperately wanted others to see him as. The realization settled uncomfortably, but honestly, within him. Weeks later, the investment venture collapsed entirely. Nathan disappeared from group conversations, offering no explanation, no apology, no acknowledgement of the financial damage left behind. Owen and Derek, similarly affected though to a lesser degree, distanced themselves quickly from Duke, their earlier camaraderie evaporating rapidly once genuine hardship replaced the easy confidence they had all previously shared. Duke found himself, for the first time in years, entirely alone, without the reassurance of his friend group, without the daily presence of his wife and children, forced finally to confront the full weight of the choices that had led him to this isolated moment. He sat alone one evening, reviewing the financial damage, understanding clearly the extent of what he had risked and lost. The numbers were significant, though not entirely catastrophic, recoverable with time and disciplined effort. But the deeper loss, he understood now, with painful clarity, extended far beyond the financial realm entirely. He had lost the easy trust of his wife, the daily presence of his children, the comfortable illusion of friendships that had, in reality, offered little genuine support when circumstances grew difficult. He had spent months chasing external validation, only to discover, in its absence, how hollow that validation had always been. Sitting alone in his quiet house, surrounded by the remnants of ambitions that had cost him nearly everything meaningful in his life, Duke began, slowly and painfully, the process of genuine self-reflection he had avoided for far too long. He picked up his phone and called Elena, his voice carrying none of the earlier defensiveness or desperation that had characterized his previous attempts at reconciliation. "I understand now," he said quietly, once she answered. "Not just what I did wrong, but why I did it. I've spent so long trying to prove myself to people who never genuinely cared about my well-being, while taking for granted the one person who always did." Elena remained silent for a long moment, considering his words carefully before responding. "That's an important realization, Duke. But understanding is only the beginning." "I know," he said. "I'm ready to do the work required to genuinely change, however long that takes." The conversation ended, without immediate resolution, without promises of reconciliation or return. But for the first time in months, Duke felt something shift within himself, a genuine willingness to confront his own flaws honestly, without the protective distance of blame or denial he had relied upon for far too long. The road ahead remained uncertain, but Duke understood, finally, that meaningful change would require far more than words alone. It would require sustained, genuine effort, patience, and a willingness to rebuild trust slowly, without any guarantee of the outcome he hoped for. He was, for the first time in a very long while, entirely alone with himself. And within that solitude, he began the difficult but necessary process of becoming someone worthy of the family he had nearly lost entirely. The months that followed tested Duke in ways he had never previously experienced. Rebuilding trust, he quickly discovered, required far more patience and consistency than he had initially anticipated, particularly when the person he had hurt most deeply remained understandably cautious about extending renewed faith in his intentions. He began attending regular counseling sessions, initially at Elena's suggestion, though he soon found genuine value in the process independent of any expectation regarding reconciliation. Sitting across from a calm, attentive counselor named Farah, Duke found himself confronting patterns of behavior he had carried since childhood, insecurities, rooted in a persistent need for external validation that had shaped many of his most significant decisions throughout adulthood. "You mentioned your father valued success above almost everything else," Farah observed during one particularly difficult session. "How did that shape your own understanding of self-worth?" Duke considered the question carefully before responding. "I think I always believed love and respect had to be earned through achievement. That being ordinary, being simply present and reliable, wasn't enough to deserve genuine admiration." "And how did that belief affect your marriage?" Duke exhaled slowly, the realization settling uncomfortably within him. "I think I started measuring my worth by how impressive I appeared to others, rather than by how genuinely present I was for the people who actually mattered most in my life. Elena was always there, steady and reliable, and somewhere along the way, I mistook that steadiness for something less valuable than the excitement and validation I received from chasing bigger, riskier ambitions." Farah nodded thoughtfully. "Recognizing that pattern is significant progress, Duke. But recognizing it is only the first step. The real work involves consistently choosing differently, especially when old insecurities resurface." Duke took these sessions seriously, applying what he learned not just theoretically, but through consistent daily actions. He requested reduced hours at work temporarily, prioritizing time with his children whenever Elena allowed visitation, showing up reliably, rather than offering vague promises easily broken. During one visit, he took Caleb and Mia to the park, spending the entire afternoon fully present, without checking his phone, without mentally drafting plans for future ventures or calculating how the outing might appear to others. He simply pushed Mia on the swing, listened attentively as Caleb explained an elaborate game he had invented with his classmates, and found, within these ordinary moments, a genuine sense of contentment he had rarely experienced during his months of relentless ambition. Elena noticed these changes gradually, cautiously allowing herself to acknowledge the consistency emerging in Duke's behavior, though she remained careful not to rush toward premature reconciliation. "You seem different lately," she observed one afternoon, as they discussed logistics regarding the children's upcoming school events. "I'm trying to be," Duke replied honestly. "Not for you, though I hope eventually that matters too. Mostly for myself, and for the kids." Elena studied him carefully, searching for any trace of the defensive insecurity that had once characterized so many of their conversations. She found, instead, a quieter confidence, one that seemed rooted less in external achievement and more in genuine self-awareness. "I've noticed you haven't mentioned Nathan or the others in a while," she said. Duke nodded slowly. "I don't really talk to them anymore. After everything with the investment fell apart, they disappeared pretty quickly. I think I finally understand what you were seeing in that friendship all along." "What was that?" "A group of people who valued my usefulness more than my actual well-being. People who encouraged my worst instincts because it made them feel better about their own choices." Elena remained quiet for a moment, considering his words carefully. "That's a difficult realization." "It was," Duke admitted, "but an important one." Their conversations continued gradually over the following weeks, cautious but increasingly genuine, rebuilding a foundation of communication that had eroded significantly during the months leading up to their separation. Elena remained in her own apartment near the children's school, maintaining independence, while allowing Duke consistent, meaningful involvement in their children's daily lives. She also continued pursuing her own personal growth during this period, returning more seriously to her painting, eventually selling several pieces through a small local gallery, an achievement that brought her genuine pride, independent of any validation from Duke or anyone else. She began recognizing her own worth more clearly, understanding that her value had never depended on being perceived as instrumental to someone else's ambitions, but existed fully and independently within herself. One evening, several months after their initial separation, Duke arrived to pick up the children for a scheduled visit, finding Elena in the kitchen, examining one of her recent paintings with quiet satisfaction. "That's beautiful," he said sincerely, studying the canvas carefully. "I didn't know you had returned to painting so seriously." "I needed something that was entirely mine," Elena explained. "Something that reminded me who I was, outside of being a wife or a mother." Duke nodded, understanding more deeply now the importance of what she was describing. "I'm proud of you," he said quietly. "I should have told you that more often, about everything you've always done, not just the painting." Elena looked at him carefully, searching his expression for sincerity. She found it, clear and unmistakable, a genuine acknowledgement that felt entirely different from his previous, more performative attempts at appreciation. "Thank you," she said softly. "That means more than you probably realize." Their relationship continued evolving cautiously over subsequent months, neither rushing toward reconciliation nor entirely closing the door on the possibility of eventually rebuilding their marriage. They attended a few joint counseling sessions, addressing underlying issues directly rather than avoiding uncomfortable truths as they once had. Duke gradually rebuilt his career, moving away from speculative ventures entirely, focusing instead on steady, reliable growth within his existing profession. He found, surprisingly, a sense of genuine satisfaction in this more measured approach, one no longer driven by desperate ambition, but by authentic effort and patience. He also began forming new friendships, more genuine in nature, built around shared values rather than mutual validation of risky behavior. Through a coworker, he met a man named Felix, someone who approached life with a quiet confidence Duke had once mistaken for lack of ambition, but now recognized as genuine internal security. "You seem more grounded lately," Felix observed one afternoon during a casual lunch. "I've had a lot to reflect on," Duke admitted. "Nearly lost everything that actually mattered because I was chasing things that didn't." Felix nodded understandingly. "Took me a similar realization a few years back. Sometimes we have to lose the wrong things to recognize what actually matters." Duke found himself agreeing entirely with this observation, understanding it now not as abstract wisdom, but as lived, painful experience, that had fundamentally reshaped his understanding of success, partnership, and genuine self-worth. Nearly a year after their initial separation, Duke and Elena sat together at a small cafe, discussing, for the first time seriously, the possibility of genuinely rebuilding their marriage, rather than simply co-parenting amicably from separate homes. "I'm not the same person who called you a liability at that party," Duke said quietly, his voice carrying genuine humility rather than desperate persuasion. "I understand now what that comment revealed about my own insecurities, and I understand the pain it caused you." Elena studied him carefully, recognizing in his expression a sincerity that had been consistently present throughout the past several months, not merely a passing phase of temporary remorse. "I've watched you change, Duke," she said finally. "Not overnight, not perfectly, but genuinely and consistently. That matters more to me than any single conversation or apology ever could. Does that mean there's a possibility for us again?" Elena considered the question carefully before answering, her expression thoughtful rather than immediately reassuring. "I think it means we can continue exploring that possibility slowly, honestly, without rushing back into old patterns." Duke nodded, understanding completely that whatever future existed between them would need to be built carefully, with patience and continued effort, rather than assumed, simply because sufficient time had passed. As they finished their coffee that afternoon, discussing plans for an upcoming family outing with the children, Duke found himself grateful, not for the difficult months that had led to this moment, but for the clarity and genuine self-understanding those difficult months had ultimately provided. He had once believed success meant impressing others, earning admiration through risk and ambition, regardless of the cost to those closest to him. He understood now, with hard-earned certainty, that genuine success meant showing up consistently, honestly, and humbly for the people who mattered most, valuing partnership over performance, and recognizing worth not through external validation, but through authentic connection and mutual respect. The road ahead remained uncertain, filled with the ordinary complexities of rebuilding trust and navigating shared history. But for the first time in a very long while, Duke faced that uncertainty with genuine hope, grounded not in desperate ambition, but in quiet, hard-won wisdom. 2 years passed, and the small house on Willow Lane looked different from the one Elena had once driven away from in the dark. The hedge along the porch had grown taller, and someone had added a swing to the old oak tree in the front yard, Caleb's idea, insisted upon after months of asking. Elena still kept her apartment near the school for the first year, even after she and Duke had quietly begun sharing dinners again, then weekends, then eventually entire weeks together as a family. She had wanted to be certain, not swept along by hope or convenience, but guided by consistent evidence that the man across the table had genuinely become someone different from the one who had once dismissed her worth to a group of friends who no longer crossed his mind at all. When she finally agreed to move back permanently, it was not with fanfare or grand declarations, but with a quiet Sunday afternoon, spent unpacking boxes together, while the children argued cheerfully over which bedroom wall should hold which posters. Duke carried her easel up the stairs himself, setting it near the window in the spare room she had claimed as her own studio, a space entirely hers, respected without question or resentment. "You'll get good light here in the mornings," he said, adjusting the easel slightly before stepping back to admire the space. "I know," Elena said, smiling faintly. "I checked before I said yes to any of this." He laughed, a genuine, easy sound that had returned to him gradually over the past 2 years, no longer forced or performed for an audience, simply present, because he finally felt secure enough within himself to laugh without needing anyone else's approval to validate the moment. Their life together now looked different from before, quieter in some ways, though richer in others. Duke no longer attended gatherings built around impressing others with stories of risk and ambition. Instead, he spent his evenings coaching Caleb's soccer team, attending Mia's art classes, and sitting beside Elena most nights, simply present, engaged, genuinely curious about her day rather than distracted by his phone or his own unspoken ambitions. He had rebuilt his career slowly, earning a promotion within his company based on reliable, consistent performance rather than speculative risk. It was not the dramatic success he had once desperately chased, but it provided stability, and more importantly, It no longer defined his sense of self-worth the way it once had. Elena's paintings had gained modest recognition within their community, several pieces now displayed permanently at the small gallery downtown. She had begun teaching weekend art classes for children, something she found unexpectedly fulfilling, a reminder that her identity had always existed fully outside the boundaries of her marriage, waiting patiently to be reclaimed. One evening, nearly 3 years after the incident at the party that had first cracked the foundation of their marriage, Duke found himself hosting a small gathering at their home, though this one looked entirely different from those he had once organized. Felix attended, along with his wife, alongside a few other couples from the neighborhood, people who valued genuine conversation over displays of ambition or status. At one point during the evening, Felix asked Duke casually about his earlier career ventures, curious about the path that had led him to his current position. "I tried some riskier things a few years back," Duke said honestly, without defensiveness or exaggeration. "Learned some hard lessons about what actually matters." Elena, standing nearby, caught his eye briefly, a quiet understanding passing between them, unspoken but clearly acknowledged. Duke no longer needed to hide or minimize his past mistakes, nor did he feel compelled to overstate his current achievements. He simply existed, honestly and consistently, comfortable within his own skin, in a way he had never fully achieved during his years of relentless external validation. Later that night, after their guests had left and the children had gone to sleep, Duke and Elena sat together on their back porch, the same porch where Elena had once stood frozen, listening to words that had nearly destroyed their marriage entirely. "Do you ever think about that night?" Duke asked quietly, watching the stars scattered faintly across the evening sky. Elena considered the question carefully before answering. "Sometimes. Not with anger anymore, though. More like a reminder of how far we've both come." Duke nodded slowly, reaching for her hand, a small gesture that carried far more meaning now than it once had, precisely because it was no longer taken for granted. "I'm grateful you didn't give up on us completely." "I almost did," Elena admitted honestly. "But I saw something in you worth waiting for, even during the hardest months. I just needed you to see it in yourself too." "I understand that now," Duke said. "Worth isn't something you earn by impressing people who never truly cared about your well-being in the first place. It's something you build through honesty, through consistency, through actually showing up for the people who matter most." Elena smiled softly, resting her head against his shoulder as the evening settled comfortably around them. "That's a lesson worth remembering. Every single day," Duke agreed quietly. Their story, unlike the fragile, image-driven life they had once built, no longer depended on the fragile approval of others. It rested instead on something far sturdier, forged through genuine hardship, honest reflection, and the patient, deliberate work required to rebuild trust once broken. Duke had once believed that losing Elena's presence in his life would destroy him entirely. In many ways, he had been right. The man he had been before that painful separation had, indeed, been forced to disappear, replaced gradually by someone more honest, more humble, and ultimately, more capable of genuine partnership. Elena too had transformed through the experience, no longer defined solely by quiet sacrifice, but by a renewed understanding of her own worth, independent and unwavering, regardless of whether anyone else fully recognized it. Together, they had built something entirely new from the wreckage of what had nearly been lost, a partnership grounded not in performance or image, but in genuine respect, patience, and hard-earned wisdom. And as they sat together that evening, beneath a quiet sky, surrounded by a life rebuilt through honesty rather than illusion, both understood clearly that whatever challenges still lay ahead, they would face them now as true equals, finally and completely.